Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Millard Fillmore, and the focus is higher office. The year is 1843, and Fillmore is making the transition from member of the U.S. House of Representatives back to citizen of Buffalo, New York. He decided not to run for re-election after completing his fourth term in the House, and actually made a very seamless transition back to his home, his family, his friends. He's got his law practice back up and running again with his very close friends and law partners, Nathan Hall and Solomon Haven, but he still had political ambition. And he started to think about the next election cycle. The Whigs were looking to run Henry Clay, it looked like, for another time to make a run for the presidency, but there was no clear-cut candidate for vice president for the 1844 election, and Fillmore was thinking, well, what about me? Clay being a slaveholder from Kentucky, he thought he could give some regional balance by being a New Yorker, somebody from the North running, and he also was perhaps popular in the second largest state from the Electoral College perspective, Pennsylvania, because he had been so instrumental in getting that high protective tariff through the Congress in 1842 when he was chair of the Ways and Means Committee in the House. Philadelphia, a high protective tariff state, this could be attractive. And frankly, Fillmore by now had made a lot of connections, a lot of friends, a lot of supporters at both the state and the national level. He thought he was a viable candidate. He had one particular problem, and it was the gentleman by the name of Thurlow Weed, who had been his friend, his supporter, and also his nemesis in the state politics of New York. Weed being the editor of the Albany Evening Journal, very influential not only at the state level, but nationally when it came to Whig politics, and Weed wanted Fillmore to run for a different office, governor of New York. And he did it because he wanted the patronage that came with that job. That's what Weed was almost always about. Win elections, able to hand out jobs to supporters, win more elections, keep power. And Weed thought that Fillmore was the best, most viable candidate to secure the Whigs in the state governor's chair. But Fillmore didn't want the governor's job. He was really much more interested in being vice president. Weed rarely, though, took no for an answer, and he and Fillmore had gotten into it previously about some potential jobs in New York. This time, Weed had an interesting strategy. He tried to sort of kill Fillmore with kindness, praise, a whisper campaign amongst his friends to encourage him because he was going to be the savior of the party and the only person who could win as governor. And frankly, Fillmore saw through the whole thing. He wrote a letter to Francis Granger that said, "I need not say to you that I have no desire to run for governor, and I am not willing to be treacherously killed by this pretended kindness. Do not suppose for a moment that I think they desire my nomination for governor." Well, the back and forth kind of continued. Eventually, they had a sit down. Weed, Fillmore, and the former governor, William Seward, who was also in the ranks with Weed in pushing Fillmore to run for governor. And they had an agreement. Fillmore agreed that he would run for governor only if he didn't get the nod for the vice presidential nomination from the Whigs coming up in May of 1844. Well, this just played into Weed's hands because Weed had a lot of people in his back pocket in the National Party and had a lot of ability to influence things like the vice presidential nomination. Sure enough, the Whigs came together in May of 44. Henry Clay was nominated unanimously by the party for president of the United States, and the vice presidential race was really a four-man race. And Fillmore was in that race. He opened up third in the balloting on the first ballot, but he didn't really have much of a chance. Weed pulling strings behind the scenes, and Theodore Frelinghuysen of New Jersey was able to pull away on the third ballot to become the Whig nominee for vice president. True to his word, Fillmore agreed to run for governor, and he wrote Weed a rather interesting worded note when he said, "So I am in for it, and there is no escape." Maybe not so enthusiastic, but he agreed to run, and he ran hard for the position. But this was not going to be easy. The Democrats countered with a very popular senator from New York, Silas Wright. Now, Wright didn't really want to run for governor either, but he was very close with Martin Van Buren, the former president. And Van Buren had actually just lost the Democratic nomination to try to re-win the presidency, and he lost it to James Polk. Polk had emerged, and rather than go sulk about this, Van Buren was still committed to getting the Democrats in the White House and keeping the Whigs out. So he wanted to do everything he could to help Polk. That meant winning New York, the biggest prize in the Electoral College. He thought the best way to win New York was to get the best candidate to run for governor, which would bring out the voters. He wanted to have the biggest turnout he could to try to help not only now Wright win the governorship, but principally to help Polk win New York and therefore win the presidency. All of which would have made it really tough for Millard Fillmore because Van Buren's strategy actually worked. Wright agreed to run. He beats Fillmore in the governor's race by about 10,000 votes, and he pulls a lot of people into the canvass with him. And sure enough, Polk wins New York for the presidency. If he had lost New York, Henry Clay would have been president of the United States. So Van Buren's strategy worked. For the first time, Millard Fillmore suffered political defeat, losing the governor's race. He was okay. He wrote to Weed that we fear all is lost. We have, however, one consolation. We die fighting for a good cause and have done everything that honorable men could do to deserve a better fate. Much as I was averse to receiving the nomination, I do not now regret that I accepted it. My friends required this sacrifice for the cause. I gave it and gave it freely, and I neither asked pity nor commiseration for my fate. Well, Millard Fillmore settled back into his private life. In fact, he encouraged those law partners of his to actually get into politics. And sure enough, Haven was elected as the mayor of Buffalo. Hall was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. Fillmore was being pushed again in 1846 to run for governor. This time he said no. He decided to support his friend John Young, who eventually ousted Wright in a very close race. During that year, there were changes in the New York Constitution, and the next year's election in 1847 would be for the first time most of the state offices, not just for governor, but state positions like Secretary of State, Attorney General, and Comptroller, the top economic job in the state that included the Chief of Finances, the Superintendent of Banks, and the leading member of the Canal Board, which was so important because the Erie Canal had completely transformed not only the economy and transportation in New York, but for that entire region of the country. Well, Fillmore had actually turned down a chance to run for comptroller a few years before when Weed wanted him to run, but now he was thinking differently. He had been successful at the national level on economic issues as the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee. He was interested in running for this position now that it was open to the public to actually vote on it. So he tossed his hat in the ring to run for comptroller. And not only did he win, he won big, beating the Democrat Azariah Flagg by almost 40,000 votes, one of the most lopsided votes in New York history. The job of comptroller was not a part-time role like when he was a state assemblyman. This was a full-time job. So he and Abigail moved to Albany. The kids didn't come with him because Powers, his son, now ready for college, had enrolled at Harvard, and Fillmore remained committed to the education of his daughter, Abby, and she was off in finishing school in Massachusetts. But Fillmore and his wife, Abigail, went to Albany, where he got straight to work, and he worked hard on behalf of his constituents, looking for even more funds to continue to expand the canal. He also looked to update the state's banking code, did a number of other things, but he never kept his eye off of what was happening nationally on the political scene. And frankly, he was disturbed and disappointed by what President Polk was doing, who had cut back on his prize tariff that he had gotten passed in 1842, saw those rates come down. He was disappointed in that. He was also chagrined to see that Polk was getting into a war with Mexico, trying to acquire more land. He, like many of the Whigs, were not supportive of this. So he's thinking again nationally when 1848 election campaign rolled around. Now, Polk had given a one-term pledge to help secure Democratic support in 44, so he was not going to run again. The Democrats turned to Lewis Cass of Michigan as their candidate. What about the Whigs? Thurlow was involved in this selection as well, where sort of out of the blue, they rallied around Zachary Taylor, a general who had had some successful victories in that recent war, the Mexican War, but it was a political novice. In fact, he had no political ideology to speak of. He had never been interested in politics, but the Whigs rallied around Taylor and nominated him, or were going to consider nominating him for president. And then there was the open question about vice president once again. They thought if Taylor was going to be nominated as president, which he was, that's again a Southern slaveholder, Fillmore thought that he could again be a good counterbalance to that, coming from the high electoral college state of New York, and to be able to offer the fact that he was a Northerner to balance the Southern implications of having somebody from the South be nominated at the top of the ticket. Well, there were 14 people in the running this time around for vice president in the United States in the Whig convention, and he was first on the ballot along with a gentleman from Massachusetts by the name of Abbott Lawrence, a former congressman. They were really running 1 and 2 in that first ballot. This was a short turnaround. Millard Fillmore went over the top on the second ballot at the Whig convention, becoming the nominee for vice president of the United States. Now, Fillmore and Taylor were both basically quiet throughout the entire campaign. This was sort of the advice from their supporters, not to say something that could kind of get them in trouble. The one exception was on the most controversial topic, slavery, that was being asked around, and Fillmore was willing to give a statement, a consistent statement, exactly where he had stood before on the topic. He said that he regarded slavery as an evil, but one with which the national government had nothing to do. That by the Constitution of the United States, the whole power over that question was vested in the several states where the institution was tolerated. If they regarded it as a blessing, they had a constitutional right to enjoy it. And if they regarded it as an evil, they had the power and knew best how to apply the remedy. This was completely consistent, as Fillmore would often do on any topic. What did the Constitution say? He was a textualist. Whatever went in that direction, he was going to continue to support. So again, sort of no surprise here. Election day rolls around, November 7th, 1848. This is, in fact, the first time a presidential election was held on the same day across the entire country. And it was a close race. You've got Cass winning 15 states. Taylor won 15 states. But Taylor won the larger states. He won Fillmore's New York. He also won Pennsylvania, that high tariff state. Perhaps Fillmore had some influence there. But Taylor wins the presidency in the Electoral College 162 to 127. Again, this political novice coming out of nowhere is now the president-elect of the United States. And along for the ride is Millard Fillmore, vice president-elect of the United States. And that is Millard Fillmore in higher office from the life of Millard Fillmore. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.